morning, ladies and gentlemen. How is everybody today? Great, thank you so much for being here. My name is Dave Cohn. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs at the Union League Club of Chicago, and on behalf of the officers, directors, and members of our club, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's forum, which the club's Public Affairs Committee is very proudly presenting in partnership with the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, or ICPR. We have a history with ICPR that goes back many, many years. They are one of our most valued civic affairs partners, and today's program is an example of why we feel so strongly about partnering with ICPR. To talk about the Cook County property tax system, the infirmities of which were described in exquisite and perhaps excruciating detail in a series that was a collaboration between the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica, and we are absolutely delighted to have the principals involved in that stellar investigative reporting with us, and we thank you for being with us. This is, as the screen says, the first of a two-part series, which my colleague Mary will tell you a little bit more about, I'm sure. So without further ado, and to get our program underway, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, Mary Miro. Mary?
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Good, good. Thank you so much for joining us today at our Show Me the Money Forum. I want to thank Dave Cohn again and the Union League Club of Chicago for sponsoring and hosting our event today. I'd also like to thank CAN TV, who will be live streaming and recording our panel discussion. The program will be cablecast on Chicago Cable Channel 27 and at cantv.org. Please follow the event on social media using the hashtag #ShowUsTheMoney. As Dave mentioned, we're having this as part one of a two-part series. On August 22nd, same time, same space, we'll be inviting Democratic nominee Fritz Kagi to come and actually talk about his vision for reform of the property tax system here in Cook County. So we hope you can join us for our part two of that event. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our esteemed panelists who will be talking to us about property taxes in Cook County. Oops. First, we have Hal Dardick, political reporter of the Chicago Tribune. Thank you, Hal. Jason Grotto, investigative reporter for ProPublica, Illinois. Tasha Gibbons, Director of Real Estate and Tax Services of Cook County Clerk's Office. Ray Long, investigative reporter of the Chicago Tribune. And Sandhya Kampambadi, data reporter of ProPublica, Illinois. Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you here. There's a lot to talk about. Tasha, I'd like to begin the panel discussion and just kind of warm up the conversation. So in layman's terms, can you explain to us how property taxes are paid and collected in Cook County, and maybe a background of what property taxes go to support?
Sure. So those of you who are paying property taxes are probably very familiar with the two installments for collecting those taxes each year. Of course, the first installment here in Cook County is due around March 1st every year, and that is based on 55% of the last year's bill, with the second installment being the time that the final tax amount is calculated, and that is typically due around August 1st, or at least it has been in recent years. So the two installment method, it starts out with an assessed valuation on property that then is equalized. Certain things are taken out, such as exemptions, if they apply, and then tax rates are calculated, and then magically all that information appears on your bill and appears in your mailbox or your email twice a year. Okay, and what was the second part of the question?
What do property taxes go to support?
They support lots of local services. Of course, everyone knows how important it is to have your local school district whether it's citywide in a particular suburb. But the largest share of property taxes supports schools, also supports the city and county infrastructure. Those of us who are working with the government to provide services, it supports our work. Whether you're thinking of the safety of fire and police, it supports all those type of services, your local parks, and additional things like the Cook County Health System. And those are attached based on the level of service provided to each particular property. So a particular property will pay taxes to the services that is supported or tied to that particular parcel of property.
Thank you, Tasha. So how do property taxes in Cook County differ from other counties in Illinois?
Well, there are a lot of similarities. Property taxes are a matter of state law under the Constitution and the Property Tax Code, but there are also differences. Okay, so some of our provisions like to say in 3 million or more counties with 3 million or more people, and there are differences based on the timing of when the taxes are due at its most simple form. So in other counties, they may be due June 1st and September 1st instead of the March and August. That's one of the minor differences. The other thing is some counties, the property tax cap law does not apply to taxing districts in certain counties, whereas in Cook County, it does to qualifying districts. Of course, home rule units are accepted from that. And then another difference is with property taxes in Cook County, because we have a classification system for property here, unlike other counties, it finds its basis in the Illinois Constitution, and it's set up by statute and local ordinance for this classification. So because of that, your industrial, your commercial, you look around, all the buildings downtown here are valued at a different percentage of their full market value than your residential property. Now that's different than the other counties. Because of that, statutorily, all property is to be assessed at 33 1/3% or 1/3 of its full market value. So as a result, all the property within Cook County, then as a total, as a whole, gets equalized, and typically that equalization factor is going to vary between 2 and 3 to come up with the assessed value or your taxable value that then forms the basis for your taxes. In other counties, there is an equalization factor, but typically it's 1. And it's again so that all counties, the outside of Cook and within Cook, are basically being assessed similarly.
Thank you so much, Tasha. So your property is assessed at a certain value point, and let's say you feel that this value or this assessment is unfair. So you appeal this. Can you, in a little bit of layman's terms, explain how one might appeal that assessment?
Sure. So here in Cook County, we do have a
Thank you.
triennial reassessment system. So every 3 years, depending on where you live, you'll be receiving your assessment notices. Or if it's a non-triennial year and there's changes, then you'll also receive an assessment notice in the mail. Once that notice goes out, it also advises you of the time within which you could appeal your assessment or the value of property under the classification as set forth by the assessor. So you would appeal first at the Cook County Assessor's Office according to their timing. It's organized by township. So with that, you file the documents that in support of your appeal and then see what happens and can obtain relief if it's appropriate, if there's a reason to reduce the assessment at the assessor. Subsequently, or even if you miss your deadline at the assessor, the Cook County Board of Review is charged with reviewing assessments. So at a separate time that's also organized by township, there's the ability for property owners to file challenging the assessed value that's been set or even reduced by the assessor, and that's done at the Board of Review. So it's a second level of appeal. And then at the Board of Review, there's both the ability to challenge the valuation based on it being overvalued, or perhaps someone wants to challenge a property based on it being undervalued, say if a taxing district thinks that that might be the case. Finally, there's a third level from which taxpayers can appeal their assessments if they have filed at the Board of Review. Okay, if they filed at the Board of Review and are still not pleased with the result of that assessment, then they have the option to either file before the Illinois Property Tax Appeal Board and again submit evidence, or they are able to file a tax objection, a case in circuit court, and pursue relief there. They have different standards and rules that apply depending on where they file.
Thank you so much, Tasha. That was great background for the rest of our discussion. Thank you. So now I'd really like to dive into the tax divide series. For the other panelists joining us today, the tax divide revealed that there is an unfair burden placed on homeowners and minority communities. So I'd love to really there's a lot to talk about. I'd love to just kind of begin with what inspired this series and the historical coverage of property taxes that you guys have worked on, and what really prompted this research and analysis.
So we started reporting the tax divide in June of 2015. I had been working at the Tribune for some time and had done a lot of work on both the pension issues facing the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and the Chicago public school system. And after a series of stories about that issue, looked at borrowing at the city level and at the school district, basically irresponsible use of issuing municipal debt and the use of the debt. And then I went away on a fellowship, and when I came back, or while I was there, decided that it would be good to look at the revenue side of the picture. So we had looked at debt and we had looked at liabilities, and we felt like that it would be important to now look at revenue. And as Tasha mentioned, the largest revenue generator for local government is property tax, the property tax. It's a shared burden. It should be shared equally. And it's basically a community coming together and saying, we're going to tax the physical property in order to provide basic services for the citizens. And so, we started looking at the data, and one thing we decided early on, if you look back at a lot of the coverage of property tax issues, and it has been an issue for decades in this county, because there have been major problems long before Mr. Berrios. This is a historical issue. If you look back, a lot of the coverage was almost more of political coverage. It was more what tax attorneys are benefiting, and as we all know, many of the tax attorneys who appeal property taxes are also political leaders. And, that raises a lot of issues. There's a lot of campaign money involved in the appeal of property taxes, but we felt that on a certain level, the more important issue that hadn't been dealt with was what was the brass tacks of how they did the work inside the office. How good of a job were they doing? What are the technical measures that you can use to evaluate the accuracy and fairness of assessments in Cook County? Mm-hmm. And that's what we really put our focus on.
Thank you. So the property tax laws in Cook County are different than the rest of the state. So how long has it been this way, and how did it really come to be like that?
Historically, it was set in the Constitution, 1970 Constitution. And the idea was that in Cook County, because it was a larger industrial and commercial base than the rest of the state, that they could pick up a larger share of the burden and lessen the burden on homeowners, particularly in the city of Chicago and other areas where people were poorer, and it was an outsized burden on some people. Although it had been done prior, as I understand it, to that Constitution informally. So it was sort of enshrined. So it goes back many, many decades. It's been a source of controversy over the decades too, in some ways, because collar counties feel as though they sometimes have an advantage in attracting businesses because they can offer them lower taxes because they're assessed at the same level as the rest of the homeowners. But once it's done this way, it really be very difficult to go back to assessing everybody the same way as the rest of the state for political reasons, because people would be up in arms.
If I could just add to what Hal was saying, that's absolutely right. In fact, it's one of the major problems culturally with the office is that for literally generations, the office has done what it wanted to do. There was something that it's often referred to as the de facto assessment level, which meant the office itself just decided in a back room what the assessment levels would be for various people. And during the 1970 convention, there was actually a huge fight over classification. And it was a deal that was cut in order to allow Chicago to continue this de facto level of assessment where they did codify what they had been doing, but prior to that, it hadn't been really laid out in law. And so I think it's important as we face how to reform the system to understand the history of the system. And that history is one of being opaque, having an agency that is able to operate without any checks or balances. And that's what really is going to need to change to fix it.
Thank you. So Hal, you talked a little bit about why the laws are different in Cook County or how they came to be this way with commercial and industrial properties being assessed differently. So let's talk a little bit more about that, and I open this up to the whole panel. How are industrial and commercial properties assessed differently than residential, and how is this affecting the average homeowner in Cook County?
Basically, and take a sort of an elemental step back, and the way that property taxes are assessed is government bodies decide how much money they want and want to collect in total. That's the total levy. And then they assess people's properties, and based on what percentage your assessment represents of the total pie, that's how much you're going to pay in taxes. That's your share of taxes. And what they do in Cook County currently is homes are assessed at 10% of their value. And so your assessed value is theoretically 1/10 of the market value. Commercial properties and industrial properties are assessed at 25% of the value. So basically 2.5 times higher than the rest. So that shifts the burden, assuming that the assessment process was done correctly in the first place, from residential to industrial and commercial properties.
Thank you. Jason, you began to talk about former assessor administrations and sort of the history and the context of what has brought us to our current state of property taxes. Over the past administrations, different models have been suggested, sort of pledges made to amend the property tax system. To the panel or to Jason, what were some of these models that were suggested to improve? Were these changes made? And yeah.
So you have to kind of break this up into two buckets. There's residential valuations and assessments, and then commercial and industrial. I won't even talk about the incentive ones. And the two types of properties are valued differently. For residential, they're valued using statistical methods called regression, where you look at sales, properties that have sold, and you look at the characteristics of those property, mainly square feet of living space is the main one, and location are the two most important variables. And you sort of extrapolate based on sales what similar homes would be valued at. And prior to the mid-1980s, don't quote me on that, it's around the maybe mid or late 1980s, prior to that, most of this was done by hand. And there, again, a long history of issues with that. But beginning, I think it was the late 70s, there was a study done out of the University of Illinois Chicago that found very similar issues that we found in our series, which was that certain parts of the city where homes were low value were being overvalued, and other parts of the city where homes were higher value were being, low-valued homes are being overvalued, high-value homes are being undervalued. That's an important concept called regressivity. So essentially, as the value of your home rose, your assessment accuracy or the level, the value was actually lower. And so the office developed a new computer model. Technology is also a really important character in this whole story, because I think it was 1984. Again, don't quote me on the exact date, but they started using computer-based regression models. And there turns out there was an issue even then, because at that point there had been an assessment level. It was either 22 or 16% at the time. But historically, the office had been valuing some residential properties, particularly in the north part of the county, lower than others. And so they had an issue, and so when they developed this model, they included in it something that they referred to as the adjustment factor, which essentially calculated a value for the home, all the homes, and then using some statistical methods, purposely undervalued all those homes by roughly 40%. So that when you took the 22 or 16% assessed value onto the lower market value, the decreased market value, you came up with an assessed value of 10%, even though the statutory level was 16 or 22, depending on the year. I think it was 16 throughout this whole time. Yeah, okay, throughout this whole time. And so that creates a huge issue, because now any kind of public policy decision that you want to try to make about how the tax burden should be shifted is now muddied. And then it just snowballed from there, because, essentially, on a certain level, they were screwing business owners. And in fact, that came out after time, because there's a constitutional provision that says if you do have classification, one class of property cannot be 2.5 times greater, assessed 2.5 times greater than another class. And what happened when they did this was that commercial properties were now more than 2.5 times greater, assessed 2.5 times greater than residential properties. So, okay, you want to give residents a break because they're the ones that vote and businesses don't, and you want to go out and, as a politician, tell everybody that you're giving them a tax break. But then you're not even honest on that part. And so you expose, or the system's exposed to legal challenges. And in fact, there's a case that's been in the courts, weaving its way through the courts for the last 10 years on this issue, and other issues related to this. So, sorry if I went off the rails there. But the point is just they started using these models. And then, so fast forward to 2008, then Assessor James Houlihan announces a provision or a measure to try to clear up a lot of the issues going on with the tax system, the property tax system, and they passed an ordinance that changes all of the assessment levels. So residential goes from 16 to 10, which is what they had been doing anyway. They're basically trying to codify all of the things that they had been doing before. Commercial at that time, I believe, was assessed at 36% of the market value, and they lowered that to 25%. However, if you look at the data, it turns out that they had been lowering that over time, long before the ordinance was passed. So again, more muddying of a system that should be very clear to every taxpayer and to every policymaker so that decisions can be made rationally. And so as they did that in 2008, this passed in, I believe, late 2008, and then what do you have? You have the financial crisis and the collapse of the housing market. And that exacerbates the whole issue. And now nobody knows what's up, because suddenly they started trying to value everyone properly, right, at 10%. But because they removed the adjustment factor, even though the housing market was crashing, some people's property values went up. And so the taxpayers themselves are totally confused in this county. I mean, Hal had a great story I think it was last week or this week, about people reacting now to some of the changes. And they're outraged, they're confused, and that's because there has not been a transparent, clear, rational property tax system in this county for decades. So I describe the housing market crash as kind of like a pier going, like one of those long piers that go out in the water, and the tide goes out, and you see all the barnacles on the pier, right? And so I think that had the housing market crash not happened, we may not have known as clearly, it wouldn't have been as dramatic, all of these underlying issues.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about the role of technology in property tax model. In previous administrations of the assessor's office, they've been confronted on potentially using sort of a human element, or that they have, in their defense, said that we use sort of a personal element to evaluate or to make these assessments, as opposed to a more mathematical or computer mapping sort of model. Can you guys talk a little bit about that? So what is the hand check model, and how has this really affected the accuracy of assessing property value?
The hand check is, there's a couple of things that they do. They run the regression model that Jason talked about, and we learned a lot more about this. The Tribune sued the assessor's office for some documents that they had denied in the early stages of the reporting. We're still waiting, and the appellate court just recently ruled in our favor. We're still waiting for Assessor Barrios to decide whether he's going to try to appeal or turn that stuff over. But we did get a hold of some of the depositions in the case. And what they were doing was they were running the regression model and then looking at that and taking out outliers, which is legitimate. So you take out, if you've got a mansion in a sea of bungalows, and it skews the results, you remove that from the formula and then run it again so that you don't have anomalies skewing the process. And then they come back and the analysts in the office go over it and they look for, they do hand checks, and they say they're hand checking every single property, which is really kind of amazing considering the size of the system, and there's 1.87 million properties.
This would be like a manual kind
Yes,
of
yeah,
double checking
yeah. So they do
of
it by hand.
Okay.
And the rule of thumb, according to the experts, is that through this process, you might change 1 or 2%. You find characteristics of the home were wrong number of rooms, wrong number of square footage, things of that nature, a long list of things that make up the characteristics of the home. But in the hand check process, according to this deposition of the person in charge of residential assessments, they were changing 20 to 25%. So Jason talked about how they were doing things by hand. Well, they're in effect still doing a huge chunk of these things by hand. And without a real firm set of standards. And in some cases, they said they were even looking at Zillow for characteristics of the home. You can all go home tonight, look up your house in Zillow and see how accurate that is. But so there were all these changes made in the process, and what it does is it opens it up to taking a regression model that may not have been working in the first place and perhaps making it even more unfair because you're starting to judge things differently.
And I just add, zero documentation that we've ever seen about what properties are being changed by hand and why they're being changed. Zero.
In the Tax Divide series, you interviewed several homeowners who were faced with sort of these, the assessments. Many of them tried to appeal the assessment. Can you talk about what the success rate is for folks, particularly on the south and west sides of Chicago, and how successful they were in appealing those assessments, and how potentially the appeal process led to sort of additional burden?
So, okay. So when we first confronted the assessor's office about the regressivity and the errors that we found in their valuations, what we were told was, well, the appeal system fixes all of that, that anybody, anywhere in the county can appeal their property tax, and that straightens everything out, and that we work with everyone, and we're going to work hard to get those values lowered. And in fact, 80% of the people, regardless of where you live in the city, get some kind of reduction if they appeal on average to the assessor. However, there's a few problems. We went and checked, so we kind of reloaded our reporting and teamed up with the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. We actually co-taught a class a graduate level course that examined the appeals for residential properties, and in fact, we found it made regressivity and error rates worse, not better. And the reason it did that was because, first of all, the people who appeal were mainly, by far, white, affluent people, people in the north part of the city who also historically had been undervalued anyway and were undervalued at the time. They appealed at much higher rates. So we looked at the city of Chicago, for example, and we found that 85% of the appeals came from just a handful of neighborhoods up in the northern part of the city. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that is. One of the major reasons is we have a huge tax appeal industry of law firms. Now, first of all, just to say clearly, there will always be tax appeals, regardless of the system that you have. Tax appeals in and of themselves are a crucial part of any system that works. But in this case, the number and the level of the percentage of properties appealing in some of these areas was astronomically high. And part of that is because you had, a lot of attorneys will go out and they'll canvass a neighborhood and say, hey, you should, and some of them will even actually analyze the neighborhood and say, you're overvalued and relative to your neighbors. And there's a whole somewhat complex issue surrounding uniformity that you have to treat everyone the same, basically. And so, if you look at that by neighborhood, whole neighborhoods were undervalued, in some cases by 30, 40%. And so if your house is valued properly, you could go into the assessor's office and say, hey, I'm overvalued. And they would say, based on the principle of uniformity, yes, you are overvalued, and so we'll lower your value. Whereas in neighborhoods where they were overvalued, some of them, could have been overvalued and appeal and have a reduction and still be overvalued because they're in line with the neighborhood. And so, we found that was another reason why appeals made the system worse, is because the underlying structure, the underlying results of the data were bad. And they were just sort of bringing everything to the median in each area. So that also perpetuated it. And then the third thing is that, again, just a common theme, the utter lack of transparency on how they decide appeals. We know nothing about how they decide appeals. We know nothing about the process. We've had to go to court to get some of this information from them. And, I think that just speaks for itself. Mm-hmm. And so we found that actually appeals, long or the short of it, the appeals make it much worse.
Let me just jump in here too. The other thing to think about here is if you have, 400,000 appeals or something like that, a large number of appeals over the course of a year, and you're bringing in a lot of people and they're getting reductions, they might turn out to be happy voters too. So if you give out many breaks, people may tend to look at you more favorably when your name's on the ballot too.
One thing that an independent study found at the county was that by the time they did the hand checks, the appeals, everything, the outliers, everything in the process that could change it, they'd changed more than 90% of the property. So much for the formula.
You talked a little bit about the neighborhood impact. So if a whole community is basically assessed at this level, right? What is the impact in your reporting, in your investigation, how schools, how sort of the local economy, how other sort of community elements, crime, safety, what is sort of the impact of the property tax system as it is right now on a community level? And what were people sharing with you as you were reporting?
Well, I think it's important to understand that what we're talking about here is the distribution of the burden. The government's going to get their money. They say, the city of Chicago says we need X billions of dollars to operate. They're going to get that, from the property tax. They're going to get that money from the property tax system. The schools are the same way. So oftentimes, some of our colleagues will write and say it's taking money out of the schools or something. That's not actually true. The schools are going to, in most cases, that's not true. Schools are going to get their money. But it's a question of who pays and how is the burden distributed, and then that's really the issue. So we found in our study with the University of Chicago that there were neighborhoods, again, in the northern part of the city that were paying an effective tax rate, and the effective tax rate is simply your bill, how much you pay, divided by over the value of the home, what the home sold for. So what we found, there were neighborhoods in the northern part of the city that were paying a 1% or less effective tax rate. And then we would go into neighborhoods in the west and south sides of the city, particularly the west side, and find effective tax rates of 3%, 2.5%. So we're talking triple, right? And we did discuss a little bit in the story some of the services. The services, in some of these poorer neighborhoods are not great. The streets are chopped up and potholes and the easements are not in good shape. And so, again, you get into this whole issue of equity and fairness and all of that. So.
So this isn't to comment on the articles at all. This is just simply from the logistical, how things work, tied into that. So the taxing district, depending on its size, so say the county of Cook, that covers all property within Cook County. So when you adjust an EAV, or the taxable value, starting with the assessed value on a property on the north side, that will impact the burden that each taxpayer pays throughout the county. Okay, so if you're talking the city of Chicago, what's happening at 73rd Street could be impacted by what's happening up in Rogers Park, because that's within the city of Chicago, and the same with CPS. So there's an overlay, depending on the size of the jurisdiction, the taxing district, and a correlation then as far as the burden shifting. So what's happening with assessments, depending on the size of the district, can affect other properties. It will affect other properties, but it depends on how wide that spreads is the size of the district. And then related to that, just when you have areas that have more value, say if there's more commercial and industrial properties that include that 25% of their market value as part of the base, then that's going to affect perhaps the tax rate for the residential property owners in that area, because they have more commercial base that will contribute to how much that school district needs, how much that village needs. So those things also weigh into this. And so if you have, say, a Riverdale area that the tax base is not doing so well, whether it's commercial or residential, and yet you still have school districts that need money, that's impacted. The rate may be much higher than it would in another area because you're dealing with a lower tax base. So there's usually an inverse relationship between the value that you're working with to create tax rates and the actual rate.
On that same note, and I think it's a very important point, I did an analysis a few years ago of the effective tax rates in all of Cook County and all of the collar counties, and you have some suburbs, the south suburbs in particular, places like Harvey and Fort Heights, with effective tax rates that are so high that within a 10 to 15 year period, you're paying as much in taxes on your home as you paid for your home in the first place. And these homes aren't worth as much as homes in other areas, so you probably have folks that are struggling harder to make ends meet, and they go out and they get a loan, they buy a home without perhaps realizing that in addition to those loan payments, they're going to pay these outsized taxes that are going to, over the 30-year life of their mortgage, make them pay for their home 3 or 4 times over.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. That's great. There are, you guys have been outlining sort of some of the structural flaws with our current system. There are national, international sort of standards for property tax systems where so on a county level, the office is ensuring that they're taking an accurate measure, right, and doing accurate assessments. So what are these sort of national or international standards, and to what extent is our Cook County property tax system in compliance with those standards?
So on the commercial and industrial side, for our analysis, actually, we conducted a sales ratio study. The assessor's office says they do not conduct ratio studies, and sales ratio study are essentially taking the sale value of the property and putting that over the market value and doing an analysis of that and looking at arm's length transactions between seller and buyers, as well as, taking out those sales where it occurs between family members. So we did that analysis for our commercial industrial side, and I think Jason can talk more about the residential side as well.
Sure. So it's the same thing with both. You sort of, you take the value the assessor came up with, you divide it by an actual sale price, and you get a ratio. And if it's a 1, that means they nailed it. If it's above a 1, it's overvalued. It's below 1, it's undervalued. And if you picture a scatter plot of that and just see a bunch of dots where the bottom axis is the value of the property and the vertical is the ratio, that ratio, what you find are two things. One is that there's something called the coefficient of dispersion, which is the most important statistic, and I'm super proud that we were able to get that into a newspaper article somehow. So if you think of it like this, how close are all the dots together? Ideally, these dots will be tight. You'll have a tight distribution. And that relates to this issue that I talked about earlier of uniformity, that you're kind of treating everyone the same. Everyone's packed together. So for example, when the county was purposely undervaluing everyone's residential property, that's bad news because it wasn't accurate and fair and what the law said it should be. The good news at least was that it was pretty tight distribution. They were treating people the same. When the housing market crisis hit and they took the adjustment factor off and the model basically broke, the distribution just spread out all over the place. And so that's kind of like a random error. It's just, there's no rhyme or reason necessarily, or it's hard to figure out why the dots are where they are, and they're all over the place. That's just an error rate. The other issue is a measure of regressivity, and there's two tests. The main one is called the price-related differential, also a term we got into the story. And that is, does the distribution of those dots have a pattern? And if the pattern is that as the value of the property goes up, the dot falls, and as the value drops, the dots go up, that's regressivity in a sense. And so that's what we did for both commercial and industrial. And there are standards, international standards for how this should be. Every legitimate assessment jurisdiction does sales ratio studies. They know what the bands are. They go to conferences. People at the assessor's office every year would go to the International Association of Assessing Officers Conference. So they know what those statistics are and where they should be, and they say they didn't actually do the tests. And had they done the tests, they would have seen, as we did the analysis, and then when we were told that our analysis was totally wrong, and press conferences were held, and editorials were written in newspapers, the president, Preckwinkle, ordered up an independent study, to her credit, and an independent group came in with someone from a different state looking at the data, and they found exactly the same thing that we found, which is that they violated every standard that is well known to the leadership in the office.
So give us a sense, what's our error rate according to those?
So the IAAO, as it's known, basically says that for residential properties, you should be a coefficient of dispersion of 15, somewhere around there. And what that means is basically, you're, in 15%, you have an error rate of about 15%. That's a rough way of explaining it. The price-related differential is a little bit more complicated. It has to do with the slope of the line and these kinds of things, but it's a statistical, somewhat meaningless number of 1.03. Anything above 1.03, you're regressive. So we found in our study townships or neighborhoods where the coefficient of dispersion was 30 or high 20s. We found price-related differentials, this is on the residential side, of 1.3, 1.4, which is extremely regressive. It's much worse on the commercial side. Commercial is more difficult to value. There are some issues. So the IAAO provides a little bit more leeway when it comes to commercial. So I think a 20, 25, some people might say, are okay. I'd say more like 20. And I think what was ours, 60? I think we had 60. We had price-related differential scores of 1.6, I think. Yeah, I don't remember, but, and on the residential side, the Civic Consulting Alliance, which did the study for President Preckwinkle and Mr. Berrios, found very similar results on the residential side, and there has been no effort to date to look at the commercial side, which is something I think should happen, but it hasn't happened.
Thank you. As you know, Illinois Campaign for Political Reform is committed to improving accountability, transparency, and integrity in government. So what would increased transparency look like, whether it's internal audits or sort of publishing the reports of some of these reviews? Like, what would making the data public help us envision what increased transparency would look like?
Well, one of the things they could do is give us the documents that we sued for. That would be a good step toward transparency. Another thing is that we looked at and we delved into something called the Shackman Decree, and we looked into how there were political abuses within the office. And in addition to the Shackman Decree, there were also just questions of nepotism, where Joe Berrios had brought over a lot of his people from his previous office, where he worked for the Board of Tax Appeals, the Board of Review. And included in those were a son and a sister, and they joined up with one of his daughters who was already in the office. So they had a lot of questions as to whether that was nepotism that was necessary or not. There were county fines levied, there were court cases fought. Joe Berrios has never paid the fine on that. And so the other things that came out in our dive into the Shackman Decree was that they just had let politics in some areas dominate the office. And so there were attempts to try to change that. They brought in their own internal monitor in addition to the federal court monitor. They were supposed to have their own internal monitor, and they did. And the first person who was hired, chosen out of like 53 candidates, and had a big line of good qualities that were bragged upon in the court documents even, was Deborah Ellis, and she was there for only a short period, and she got fired basically because she got into boxing matches with the folks who were already there, and they didn't see it eye to eye with her, and she thought that some of their personnel policies were confusing at best and not kosher at worst. And so there were all kinds of internal battles here, and really one of the executive directors of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, Cindy Canary, who does her own consulting ethics works now, said, you know, if they're not controlling the inside and they're not staying on top of everything, and they're mixing all this political stuff and not looking for the best people, but rather looking to fulfill their patronage needs, then it's like garbage in, garbage out. So you've got people that are not necessarily as well qualified as maybe needed if you had a true system where you eliminated patronage, and you are not getting the true types of assessments that you really should be getting too.
And even more, the role of politics with the tax attorney industry. So you guys could talk a little bit about that. How are political relationships affecting actually the appeal process as well?
Well, we've done some studies since then. The Board of Appeals folks have also been whacked with fines for accepting more in contributions than they were allowed to. We had a story a couple of months ago. Hal and I worked on a story about how they had accepted more than $500,000 in campaign donations from law firms and other businesses that helped challenge the tax bills. And that was far more than they were really allowed under the ordinance. In fact, they were told to return about $440,000 out of $600,000 that they had collected from these firms because they had gone above the limits. There are actually limits that are around, $950, $750 in a non-election year, and $1,500 in an election year. If you go over those, you're not supposed to take that money. Joe Barrios actually has challenged that law, and that has been another court case that has been knocked around. And Barrios's argument is that, hey, he's not a rich guy. He can't always compete against well-financed people, as he said in the last campaign against Fritz Kagi, and that he should be able to collect more, and that he had followed the state rules, and that the caps came off in the state under state law, and that should have followed up and prevailed in the judgment of whether or not he should be getting hit with these county fines. And so the courts have not agreed with that argument so far, but it's still being contested. And so we've seen a lot of folks being hit with these fines, and some are they're first really threatened with the fines if they don't pay back the money, and a lot of them will then run and refund the money to the contributors, and if they just refuse to, then they get fined. Joe so far has been in the category where he is refusing to acknowledge the limits and says that the limits are unconstitutional. It's another kind of free speech argument that you should be able to contribute to the guy you want to.
There's another issue, a political issue that campaign contributions from property tax appeal attorneys and law firms is an important one, but the top firms in the business, which Sandhya spent months cleaning up the assessor's dirty data to show that the top firms are, House Speaker Michael Madigan's firm is the top in terms of total reductions, and also in the top 5 is Alderman Burke, who's been the chair of the Finance Committee for many decades now. And so there's nothing to be said about that. They're just, they're good lawyers. They do a good job. But the perception is a real issue for the office, and I think for the state, because when you have a system that's opaque, that's broken, that creates an unfair system, and then you have political leaders that are benefiting from that system, regardless of whether there's any untoward things going on, it raises a perception problem that you would think those people would want to get fixed. Because it's a constant thorn in their side, it seems like to me. So there's both an issue with the campaign contributions, but also another issue of inaccurate assessments, and then a large volume of appeals where the beneficiary of those are some of the most powerful politicians in the state.
You have, when we looked at this, the campaign contributions to Barrios, the 3 commissioners who sit on the board of review, the bulk of their contributions came from people that were involved in the property tax appeals industry, whether it was the lawyers, the assessors, the folks like that. And so you also have a system that under Assessor Barrios vastly increased the number of appeals. So you can draw the lines. It certainly raises a lot of really big questions about what's going on. Democratic nominee Fritz Kagi pledged not to take any money from that industry and did not during his primary campaign. And there are some people who think that that it might be, constitutional and proper to outlaw as a conflict of interest contributions from that industry to people who serve in these capacities.
Thank you, thank you. So Sandhya, Jason mentioned that you were digging through the dirty data that was shared. What did the data look like? What was the state of it? And walk us through that kind of experience.
Sure. Yeah, so as Jason mentioned, I spent many months cleaning this attorney database, and basically the data quality was not, so for example, if you looked at a keyboard and you see the letter E and the number 3, like how they're close to each other on the keyboard, if you looked at one of the appeal lawyers, you'd see it says Debbie without an E, it would say it with a 3. So those are the kind of errors in this database. There were also a lot of LLCs listed, so I went through LexisNexis, searching for who the owners of the LLCs are and trying to figure out, really quantifying who are the attorneys and who are the law firms really responsible for these appeals. And actually what was really surprising to me was the fact that a lot of law firms didn't even have those numbers themselves. They weren't able to do these kind of quality checks because the data was hand entered poorly. In some cases, the data was entered by, they had the address of the attorney's law firm, which, I mean, you'd have to literally research every single law firm in order to figure that out. So we basically took 1 million plus rows of data and found like 1,600 law firms from that database.
It's a really important issue that speaks to a larger problem inside the office with data integrity, what we call data integrity, it could be the biggest hurdle or one of the largest hurdles facing the reform of the system, is so much of the data is dirty, it's old. If you go on the assessor's website, for example, and search for a property, they'll have a picture. Invariably, that picture predates 2009. So like there's a Mariano's down the street from me, and when I look, at one point it was way undervalued, and I went to look at it, and it was like under construction, and before it was a Mariano's, it was a Dominic's. So it's like there's so much about the data that needs to be addressed, and the issue with the attorneys is just one prime example of like how hard is it? You standardize the name, you type it in and the name just pops up and you don't actually have to type anything in, or you barcode it, or there's so many ways in which, and it's not just at the assessor's office, obviously it's an issue that the county and the state government faces, and a lot of governments around the country face upgrading their data systems. But in terms of getting accurate values and being able to understand how the system works, it's one of the major hurdles that the next administration is going to face.
Thank you.
This is just from the clerk's perspective. It is really important to have data integrity and modernization, and I think there's room for that probably in all fields, all aspects of the property tax system. And one of the things that our office has tried to do is both improve the technology systems that we use, such as developing a portal by which the taxing districts are going back and forth with our office with their levies and checks on that and things like that. And then we've also made more information available online. So if you go to David Orr's website, there's information about the tax rates going back many years. There's a tax rate report that gives lots of detail. the TIF viewer and TIF reports that also identify the amount of money that's coming in not only through traditional sources of property taxes, but that which comes in through TIFs. And so we're using tools such as GIS and the latest that we can afford at the moment given the budget concerns. And so I think data modernization and the use of these more up-to-date applications and technologies would prove helpful. And I know that one of the things that all of the tax offices are working with right now is doing a lot of background work so that a new system, other than the mainframe, which is still being used about 40 years later, I believe, will be used for the tax offices, the integrated property tax system. And so it's more of a web-based technology. And in that process, at least some of the data should be cleaned up that's brought over from old data. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of going forward and having the best data set to work with to arrive at accurate information. But it's just from the perspective of what the clerk's done and things that I see happening and that could improve the property tax system.
Thank you, Tasha. So we've talked about the lack of transparency, the structural flaws of the property tax laws. We've talked about how patronage politics have also impacted the property tax system here in Cook County. If this doesn't change, if we do not have this change, or if this change to all three of those areas, increased transparency, the actual law, the code, the patronage politics, the political influence on the property tax system, if it doesn't change, what would it look like in Cook County on a neighborhood level in 10, 20, 50 years from now?
It's hard to say that far out what would happen. The one thing we absolutely know will happen is that poor, mainly minority people will continue to shoulder an unfair tax burden. The professor, Chris Berry from the University of Chicago, did a study after our stories came out of trying to quantify on the residential level what the tax shift was. And he calculated it at $2 billion. So the top 10% of value homes had shifted off of them about $2 billion. And those mainly, that money went on the shoulders of people who were the most affected by the housing market crash. So what caused the housing market crash? It's when banks and mortgage companies went out to people and said, that little bungalow is actually worth $300,000, and we're going to give you a mortgage for that. In fact, the bungalow was never worth $300,000, and once the banks couldn't provide that liquidity into the market, the whole thing collapsed. And so those people, where you see high rates of foreclosures, you see families leaving the city because they literally can't pay their tax bill. You know, that's where that's the real issue. And I guess I would say something else, which is the city and the county as well, but particularly the city, face an enormous burden of legacy liabilities related to both pension promises that were made and never fulfilled, and money that was borrowed for projects that are now gone or services that are over, that now have to be shouldered by future generations. And so if you don't have a firm grasp on what your tax base is, and you don't have a clear understanding of how to leverage that tax base and how to tax that tax base, how do you solve these massive problems that we have? Because a cloud tax isn't going to do it, and a soda tax isn't going to do it. It's going to end up being a property tax, because that is the fundamental tax on how we pay for things. It's what brings in the money. And so think about if you started valuing some of the commercial properties downtown and started valuing some of the higher end properties accurately, your tax base is going to rise if this is done right. And when the tax base rises, the rate will fall because of what Hal said. And so hopefully will the multiplier will actually probably fall a little bit more. But there could be potentially, for political leaders who are brave enough, some room there to increase the levy and not have the pain that you're going to have otherwise, to start to deal with some of these structural problems that you have.
Thank you, Jason. So now I'd really love to open up the panel discussion to questions from the audience. We have Maddie here with the microphone. She's going to come up. So if you'd just like to raise your hand, and Maddie will come find you. Thank you. We have a gentleman in the back. Please say your name.
Yeah, good evening. Warren Dixon, Naperville Township Assessor out of DuPage County. Like to say we have a COD of 9.5 and a PRD of 1, so the best in the state of Illinois for that. But my question goes to the undervaluation that's happened here in the Chicago Loop and what that impact could be statewide to the school funding formula. Since the school funding formula's foundational pillar is EAV and it places CPS in a tier 1 position, is that undervalue directly diverting dollars away from other school districts outside of CPS because of that undervaluation?
I think that there is a potential for that to be the case, but it's hard to know until they address all of the problems within the system, because you could increase the commercial EAV and lower it in some of the more struggling economic areas in the city and on the smaller businesses, and the size of the total EAV won't necessarily grow, but it would be a fairer distribution of the EAV, and the people that could afford to pay those taxes the most couldn't. But until those things are addressed, I think it's tough to know whether all as a whole the city is being undervalued.
I would just reiterate something that we mentioned earlier, which is this again goes back to really broad public policy questions that can't be dealt with. Illinois relies heavily, too heavily some would say, on the property tax to fund education. And so, these issues that Warren has been raising, are important because how do we make a decision about how to fund our schools if these other basic questions that are really mechanical, technical questions aren't just dealt with? So then, maybe it is the school funding formula would change, but maybe that's not the way we'd want to go forward. Right now, we just don't know which way to go.
I'd like to throw it back to you because you have obviously some well-thought reason behind that. And have you made any conclusions on this yourself? Have you been able to see how the devaluation or the undervaluation of the city could impact the rest of the system?
Well, I think as Jason has stated, and we've had the opportunity to work a little bit together, the undervaluation of the Chicago Loop, we know we've got one of the fastest growing areas, 52 cranes in the air, 10 projects over $1 billion going up, and annually we see the Willis Towers recently sell in 2015 for $1.3 billion, and it's assessed at 42% of the fair market value. We're talking substantial. We believe that the offset of the lowering of the South and Southland and West suburbs would not overtake that undervaluation that's there. Again, to Mr. Grotto's point, that the rate is even a bigger impacting factor than the overvaluation for the lower income areas of the South and Southwest areas. So as we lower that rate, they're going to see more and more relief. I think the challenges that incoming assessor Kagi will have is that the effective competitive tax rates with areas like Atlanta, Dallas, New York, when we're looking at 2.5% effective tax rates, if we were to raise the Willis Towers today to $1.3 billion, we might have an effective tax rate near 4%. And what's that impact to the local economy is how do we gradually get to that point is going to be one of those challenges that incoming assessor Kagi is going to have to face.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be jarring for the people who have been underassessed for a long time if this suddenly gets corrected, right? So there's going to be people who have had very good tax bills based on the value of their property who will suddenly be wondering why their property tax bill shoots up if there is a big correction.
Do we have another question? Yes, sir. We're over here. Gentlemen, please say your name.
Yes, my name is Clifton Graham. I'm from the south suburbs. I've been appealing my taxes for about 20 years, and of course, I've had no results. And when I finally have had an appeal that has gone up, they say my value today has increased $50,000, and I know that that is far from true, especially knowing the research that I've been aware of for the last 5 years. I just want to ask the panel, realistically, we all know it's been unfair to the south side and the south suburb and the west side. What is a realistic, fair, especially the question would go directly to Ms. Kay. I couldn't pronounce your name, forgive me, since you have the information on all the data. What is it that would be a fair shake for the victims as whose value has remained the same for the last 20 years, and for all my neighbors and my friends who have lost their home through foreclosures, through all the seniors who property has been stolen through overtaxing and having to pay back taxes at 18% back to somebody who has basically preyed on their financial inequity, been able to afford to stay in their home. So we're looking at now he's gonna make these adjustments on these property taxes to tax the so-called, I guess, the rich. And Barrios is gonna make off better than Bernard Madoff. So what is we as a whole gonna do to make it fair to the communities that's been a victim for the last 30 years?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there's obviously a lot there. First of all, there is currently a civil rights and fair housing lawsuit going on, and so, you know, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I know that there have been others attorneys, civil rights attorneys, who have looked at whether or not it's possible to, for lack of a better term, recoup some of the excess property taxes that have been paid. It's a very thorny issue. I don't think there's a legal avenue or slipstream to be able to do that. Everyone is going to have to go through a period of adjustment here. And one of the really horrible things about what's happened is you take some of the communities, especially in the south suburbs, that have really high tax rates right now. Some of that does have to do with the assessor, but most of it has to do with the fact that the commercial and industrial base in the south suburbs have eroded at a dramatic rate over time. And as we were told earlier, when that happens, when you have a classification system where you're taxing residential at 10% and commercial and industrial much higher, and you lose that commercial and industrial base, the tax rates, the base falls and the tax rates climb really high. And that's what's happening down there. Again, if you don't have a clear system and a transparent system, it's very difficult to start to address some of those fundamental issues.
I do think your question is very good, though. I talked to a mother in Chatham that bought a house a few years back, and there was an adjustment in her assessment that lowered it significantly, and her question to me was, well, how do I get the money back that I was paying in previous years that I shouldn't have been? And it's a really difficult question.
And just one other little thought, and this is from seeing how the tax rates are higher in a lot of the areas that the value's lower. Even if it's unfair at the moment, any of the assessments, and I'm not saying one way or the other, but what happens is with those high tax rates, we see, you know, and hear from people that it's challenging for new business to come into those southern suburbs. Where are those high tax rates when just over the county line or in another area, there's a different tax rate? And so because of that, it's harder for that commercial base to build up. And that's just something that we see over time, and what solutions there can be that may be a bigger public policy discussion than just the assessment, because there is that inverse relationship between the values and the rates in order that taxing districts such as schools can still provide an education to its residents.
Thank you, Tasha. Maddie, oh, there you were. You're behind the thing. I couldn't see you. There you are.
Oops. Yes, my name's Anita Constant. I'm a resident of Lakeview, the north side, where you say we have been treated, we have an advantageous tax rate, and that may be true. I certainly haven't felt it. I looked at my taxes over the last, I purchased my property in '89, and my taxes have gone up every year, even in 2008 and 2009 when the property values sunk. But I expected that. The house appreciated. But this year, and no one has made mention of this, there seems to be some new model that has been proposed and is being used. And I guess Lakeview is one of the first to be put through this new model. And this model, the result of this is that the increases, as stated by your paper, are about 30-some%. Well, on my street, they're averaging about 70-some%. And I guess I don't object to righting a wrong if we have been underassessed and we do need to pay more fine, but you can't do that all at once. People are being forced to sell. I went to a community meeting where a woman stood up and talked about the fact that her property is what is paying to put her disabled son through school. Well, she says, I'm going to have to sell. You're either going to have to sell or you're going to have to take a second mortgage on your home when your property taxes, go from $16,000 to $30,000.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear about the new model.
No, I think this is a really good point. I'll step back for a second because I don't think we covered some of the things we found. After the housing market crash in 2009, the former assessor had received a lot of calls about there's an issue with the assessments, that the values went up even though the market was crashing. And Assessor Houlihan at the time reached out to the MacArthur Foundation. And the MacArthur Foundation provided a large grant to allow the assessor to work with the University of Chicago and a economic development consultant to build a new model. This was back in 2009. I believe they finished around 2011 or 12, and Mr. Barrios had come into office and had tabled that project. And after much prodding by the MacArthur Foundation and the academic and the economic development consultant who worked on this, put out a press release in 2015 that said, very similar to the most recent press release that had come out, that said the assessor has adopted a new state-of-the-art model to fix regressivity and accuracy in the assessment system. That's about the time that I started reporting this story, or we started reporting this story, and my analysis suggested that they never actually adopted that model. So we went to the assessor and we said, it doesn't look like you used this model. And we also got copies of the model and we learned how to run the model. We ran the model ourselves in the background to check it and test it. But when we confronted them, the assessor first said, well, we used two models. We used our old model and our new model. And so we said, okay, well, if you use two models, we found all of these errors in the new model that you created. You were messing with the model in ways that you weren't supposed to. Well, how do you know that? Well, the documents you gave us in the instruction manual says that you did it wrong. And then they said after that, well, and then we also said, well, how did you use both models? Which properties did you use? Did you use them together? Did you divide the two? Did you use them on everyone's property? We're not going to tell you that. Okay? Then we keep pushing. Then they say, Well, we didn't use the model, the MacArthur-funded model, because it was totally inaccurate. It was terrible. And then they start disparaging the people that built the model, even though their press release from 2015 quoted both Julia Stash, who's the president of the MacArthur Foundation, and the two people who worked on the model. They had no idea that they hadn't implemented the model. And then first, when I went to them, they didn't believe me. It took me months of going back and asking questions and showing them data, right? So that happened. Then our story comes out and they say, we're totally wrong, our data's flawed, I'm not a fair reporter, blah, 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 blah. There's an independent study that shows we're actually totally corroborated everything we found. And then lo and behold, a few months later, they come out with this new model. And I think Hal and maybe Ray can talk a little bit about the new model. From what I've seen, it appears to be an improvement from the data that I've looked at. But again, this goes back to this issue that we keep, that it's like a constant drumbeat. When you're not upfront and honest and clear about these systems, people live for years and years and years under a certain set of assumptions. And then somebody like us, people like us come along and say, hey, it's totally unfair. And you know, what people want in any kind of taxation, nobody likes to pay property taxes. But what they want more than anything else is for it to be fair. And when they want, you know, as long as they know it's fair, they'll pay. Yeah, they might bitch, you know, nobody likes taxes. But we all know that it's a contribution to the community. And now there's people like you, which is almost the reverse, the opposite side of the coin of the people in North Lawndale who've also have had to sell their homes, or people in the south suburbs that also have had to cope with this, or abandon their homes outright. And so I think that's the real thing, is like, not to get all mushy, but as like a community, we all have to get together and realize that this has been a problem for many, 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 many decades, and that maybe there does need to be some kind of slow movement to fix it. I don't know what that's for public policy people to figure out, but they can't figure it out if they don't have an accurate picture of what's going on.
Thank you.
The Civic Consulting Alliance is helping bear us with a new formula. We've asked him to show us the formula. As of yet, he hasn't. So again, this trust builds. I would point out there's a much broader issue here for another day, and I'll do it in 30 seconds, and that is Illinois is one of 2 states in the nation that still primarily relies on property taxes to fund their public schools across the state. And it's a 19th century agrarian model of taxation that is wildly regressive, inherently wildly aggressive, because it doesn't depend on people's ability to pay. And older folks who have lived in their homes forever and maybe paid them off and bought them a lot cheaper, and their property values have gone through the roof because the neighborhood changed, they may not be able to, and that goes to a problem in the system as a whole, and not necessarily into this other unfairness that we found that makes it even more unfair.
Thank you. We have another question right here.
Hi, my name is Anthony Travis. And as I turn around and I look at this room and we talk about a solution, we are the problem, all of us. We sit back and we let Madigan, Burke, Cullerton use their power in politics to rape our communities. Now, some folks may not like that word, but when you financially rape communities, you're destroying communities. I take my hat off to this panel because you guys have shown us what happens when we as people, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, if we don't work together to solve some of these problems, they're gonna fester. We have folks losing their homes because they can't afford the taxes. We have folks in the black community losing their business because they can't afford the taxes. And we got folks in Springfield and the city council who make millions of dollars off of this broke system. And unless all of us, black, white, Hispanic, stand up and say, damn it, enough of this crap. We got to send folks to Springfield who want to change the economic system, how we fund these damn schools. A lot of these schools, districts should merge with each other. That's one solution. The other solution is to get the damn schools off of the property tax system. It needs to change. Out in California, Governor Brown went towards what I call the Wall Street tax, capital gains tax, to fund the schools out there. It's working. It can work here. There's all sorts of ways that we can bring in additional revenues to fund schools.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
I'm fed up. You should be fed up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. One more question. One more question.
Thank you so much for coming out. We all have all read all your studies. My name's Andrea Rayla. I'm the president of TRAIN. We did 2 studies that we forwarded to some of the panel there. One was a study in the south suburb that talked about Jason's, pointing out the foreclosures there. In Thornton, Rich, and Bremen Townships, some of those communities have foreclosures that represent 50% of the neighborhoods. In 2011, Cook County, the state of Illinois passed a law that said that when you look at these foreclosure neighborhoods, you should consider foreclosures in the mix of understanding how those assessments should be leveled. When we did the study of these foreclosure areas, we saw that there was no formula really to assess these foreclosures, anything but higher than 120%. And the actual quality sales were assessed on the average 20% higher. That's really unfair, but Cook County, because it's 3 million and because it has its own unique assessment system, doesn't have to comply with the state code, this new law. They don't have to comply with it. We need to bring Cook County into the same compliances that all 101 counties have. We need to give the Board of Review equalization power, and we need to come in line so that we can be overseen by the Illinois Department of Revenue. And I think if we move in that direction, we can have more of that transparency. But we would like to ask the incoming assessor to say, why don't we reassess the south suburban townships that have these high foreclosures? That can be a solution, just like we reassessed Jefferson Township and Maine Township with the airplane noise. They lowered the assessments there. And of course, the tax rates are egregious too, but there's a solution for those tax rates as well if we could do a state law that says that it's unconstitutional to have those rates at a difference of 423%. And finally, with the woman that stood up about Lakeview and talked about Lakeview, you don't have to overtax communities, middle class or even poor communities in the township of Lakeview to make up for what's happening in the inequities all around. We did another study. We reviewed all sales in Lakeview, and it showed that Lakeview, on the average, didn't get a 32% increase in sales. It actually got a 5% increase. And we looked at Hyde Park, and we looked at all the sales. We bought the sales for $5,000 from the assessor's computer. We got the FOIA from the Illinois Revenue Department, and we looked at the sales, and the sales were 18% increase in Hyde Park rather than a 3% decrease. We have to have you guys look at this data and look at what's going now on with the reassessments of the city of Chicago and what's happening in the south suburbs.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
So can I address one thing?
Yes,
Sorry. I would just say that the issue of foreclosures is an issue within the assessment industry about how to handle foreclosures, that is specifically in areas with high foreclosure rates. There is a debate about whether to include those. The other thing I would say is that IDOR's oversight of the Cook County Assessor's Office and Assessor's Office across the state is definitely something that needs to be addressed. And I don't even think the IDOR understands what their powers are, so.
I want to thank everybody again for asking these great questions as part of our Q&A session. I want to thank our incredible panelists. Round of applause for them.